Amos Sterling, a brilliant law professor and civil rights advocate, never expected his life to be upended in an instant. After delivering a keynote speech at a prestigious conference, Amos is arrested in a shocking case of racial profiling by Officer Dean Barrett. The video of the arrest spreads like wildfire, igniting public outrage and putting both the police force and Amos in the spotlight. But what begins as a fight for justice quickly reveals a web of conspiracy far deeper than anyone expected. As the courtroom drama intensifies, Amos must confront not only the corruption in the system, but also the personal betrayals lurking beneath the surface. Alongside him is Juliana Barrett, a passionate civil rights attorney, and the estranged daughter of the officer who arrested Amos. Together, they must navigate a maze of legal battles, personal conflicts, and moral dilemmas. But the real twist comes when Officer Barrett's darkest secret is revealed, forcing Amos to question whether true justice can ever be served. Will Amos find redemption, or will the burden of silence break him? With everything on the line, one man's fight for justice becomes a battle for the soul of an entire city. Amos Sterling sat at the oak desk in his Boston apartment, meticulously reviewing his speech for the legal conference. It was early morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, casting a soft glow across the room. Amos' neatly tailored suit hung by the window, waiting to be worn for the keynote event later that day. He was at the pinnacle of his career, a well-respected law professor and civil rights advocate. Amos stared at the framed photo of his mother on the bookshelf, her smile always a source of inspiration. He knew how far he'd come, from the streets of Boston's toughest neighborhoods to standing before elite legal minds across the country. His work had impacted countless lives, challenging the system and pushing for police reform. A sense of responsibility weighed on him as he adjusted his tie in the mirror. He knew his voice mattered more than ever. This speech wasn't just about legal theory. It was about showing the world that the fight for justice wasn't over. He took a deep breath, picked up his briefcase, and headed out the door. Officer Dean Barrett sat in his patrol car, sipping coffee as he scanned the upscale hotel parking lot. The call had come in about a suspicious individual lurking around, a black man. Barrett had been in the force for decades, and his instincts, hardened by years on the job, immediately went on alert. The description was vague, but Barrett's prejudices filled in the blanks. His eyes narrowed as he saw a well-dressed man step out of a sleek car. Something about the man, confident and composed, rubbed Barrett the wrong way. He picked up his radio and muttered, "Got eyes on him," before stepping out of the car, adjusting his belt, and making his way toward the hotel entrance where the man, Amos, was heading. Amos had just parked his car in the VIP section of the hotel lot when he noticed the officer approaching him. At first, he thought nothing of it. He had done nothing wrong. But the officer's stern expression and aggressive posture quickly dispelled any sense of normalcy. "Excuse me," the officer barked. "What are you doing here?" Amos took a breath, trying to remain calm. "I'm here for the conference. I'm one of the keynote speakers. Is there a problem?" Barrett smirked, his hand hovering near his belt. "A conference, huh? Let me see some ID." Amos offered his driver's license and a professional card. "I'm Professor Amos Sterling." Barrett barely glanced at the documents before shaking his head dismissively. "Professor? Huh? You don't belong here." The tension thickened as Barrett's hand went for his handcuffs. Amos' pulse quickened. He had faced racial profiling before, but something about this moment felt different. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. This was an outright assault on his dignity. Before Amos could fully process what was happening, Barrett had twisted his arm behind his back, slapping cold steel cuffs onto his wrists. The sting of humiliation was immediate, and as a small crowd began to gather, murmurs rose in the air. "Sir, there's been a mistake." "I haven't done anything wrong," Amos tried to explain, his voice calm but firm. Barrett pushed him toward the squad car, his grip tightening. "Tell it to the judge," he muttered, ignoring the shocked expressions of hotel staff and onlookers. Amos glanced around, locking eyes with a few witnesses who seemed too stunned to intervene. He felt the weight of their silence. A few people pulled out their phones, capturing the scene in videos that would soon ignite the city. As Amos was shoved into the back seat of the patrol car, a wave of anger surged within him. He had always fought his battles in court, using logic and words to dismantle systemic injustice. But this was personal. Juliana Barrett sat in her law office, buried under case files when her phone buzzed with a notification. The headline caught her attention. Black professor wrongfully arrested outside hotel. Curiosity led her to open the video, and what she saw made her heart sink. The man being handcuffed was Amos Sterling, a figure she had admired for years, a legal scholar known for his fight against racial injustice. But what made her blood run cold was the sight of the officer dragging Amos into the squad car. It was her estranged father, Dean Barrett. Juliana's hands trembled as she watched the video play out. The cold detachment in her father's expression was all too familiar. She had distanced herself from him years ago because of his heavy-handed approach to policing, but seeing this brought her worst fears to life. She turned off her phone, leaning back in her chair. Torn between her duty as a civil rights lawyer and the personal horror of seeing her father at the center of this injustice, Juliana knew she had to act. But how could she fight against the man who raised her? Amos Sterling sat in the cold, gray cell, his fingers clenched into fists at his sides. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the faint echo of officers' chatter in the distance felt surreal. How did this happen? A well-respected professor, a voice for justice, now sitting here, humiliated, dehumanized, because of his skin color. He leaned against the wall, breathing deeply, trying to calm the whirlwind of thoughts racing through his mind. His breath slowed. "Not this time," he whispered. "I won't let them silence me." He thought about the arrest, how Officer Dean Barrett had sized him up, already deciding his guilt before Amos had even spoken a word. The indignation fueled a growing fire inside him. He wouldn't let this go unchallenged. His reputation, his work, everything he'd built would not be taken from him by prejudice. Amos shifted his gaze to the cell bars, resolve solidifying. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something much larger. The injustice he faced was the same systemic racism so many others endured, but he had a voice, a platform, and he intended to use it. Dean Barrett walked into the station, shoulders squared, with an air of confidence. The arrest, in his mind, was just another task on a long list of duties to protect the public. He dropped his keys on his desk, smirking slightly as he recounted the morning. Another suspicious character, another day of keeping the streets clean. But as he settled into his chair, he noticed the other officers' sidelong glances and hushed conversations. Something was off. One of his colleagues approached him hesitantly. "Dean, you might want to take a look at this," the officer muttered, holding out his phone. Barrett's brow furrowed as he watched the video playing on the screen. His own arrest of Amos, caught on several phone cameras, now making waves across social media. The footage was stark, the narrative clear. A black man, dressed impeccably, unjustly arrested while a crowd looked on. Barrett's face paled. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. This wasn't how he'd imagined it playing out. The adrenaline from the arrest now seemed to twist into something more dangerous, public outrage. Juliana Barrett sat at her desk, staring at the phone in her hand. The video of the arrest had haunted her for hours. That was her father, Dean Barrett, making an absolute mockery of the justice system she had spent her entire life defending. She stood up abruptly, pacing her small office, conflicted between personal loyalty and professional obligation. The decision to call Amos Sterling's legal team gnawed at her, but her conscience wouldn't let her ignore it. Amos didn't deserve this, and if anyone could help dismantle what was happening, it was her. She dialed the number, her voice steady but laced with tension. "This is Juliana Barrett. I'm offering my services to Amos Sterling's legal team. We need to talk now." The viral video continued to spread across social media platforms like wildfire. Hashtags demanding justice for Amos filled the online sphere, with celebrities, activists, and everyday citizens chiming in. News outlets picked up the story within hours, amplifying the outcry. Protests were being organized in downtown Boston, the community refusing to stay silent. At the university where Amos taught, students and faculty held rallies, waving signs and chanting for justice. It wasn't just about one arrest anymore. It was about a system that had allowed this to happen. The pressure on the police department was growing, and the spotlight on Barrett was glaring. As media reporters gathered outside the station, one thing became clear. Boston would not stay quiet. The city demanded answers. The police station was buzzing with tension. Dean Barrett stood outside the chief's office, his hand hovering near the doorknob, knowing full well the storm brewing inside. When he finally opened the door, Chief Raymond Kessler sat behind the desk, his expression stern. He wasted no time, gesturing for Barrett to sit. "You're aware of the video, I assume?" Barrett nodded stiffly. "I was just doing my job." He looked suspicious. "I didn't know who he was." Kessler's steely gaze didn't soften. "It doesn't matter who he is. The public sees a black man in a suit, wrongly arrested for no reason other than his skin color. We have a problem, Dean, and it's bigger than you." Barrett shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I didn't mean. The city is on fire. The department is under scrutiny. Internal Affairs will be launching an investigation. This doesn't look good for any of us, but especially not for you." Kessler's voice was cold, detached. Barrett clenched his jaw. "I was protecting the public. I did nothing wrong." Kessler leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You'd better hope that's how it plays out in court, because right now, the court of public opinion has already condemned you." The weight of the situation finally settled on Barrett's shoulders. The confidence he had walked in with was nowhere to be found. The consequences of his actions were beginning to close in on him, and for the first time, Dean Barrett felt fear. The quiet hum of the city outside barely reached the windows of Amos Sterling's office. Inside, the tension was palpable. Amos sat at his mahogany desk, his hands clasped tightly together, staring down at the stacks of legal documents that lay before him. Across from him sat Lisa Torres, his lawyer and trusted friend, flipping through case files with sharp efficiency. "We need to hit them hard, Amos," Lisa said, breaking the silence. "Racial profiling, wrongful arrest. We have the evidence, and we have the public on our side." Amos leaned back, his gaze distant. "I don't want this to be about vengeance. This is bigger than just me. It's about the system, the way it continues to fail people like me, people who don't have the resources to fight back." Lisa looked up, her expression softening. "I know, but this is our chance to make a statement. If we win this, it could set a precedent." Amos nodded, though the weight of the upcoming legal battle pressed heavily on his shoulders. "We'll file the charges. But remember, this isn't just about Officer Barrett. It's about a system that allowed him to do what he did." The determination in his voice set the tone for the meeting. Amos knew that this fight wasn't just his. It was for every person who had been wronged by the very institutions meant to protect them. As the team strategized, the resolve to see this through only grew stronger. At his small kitchen table, Dean Barrett sat, coffee growing cold in his hands. His phone buzzed on the table, and with a sigh, he picked it up. "Barrett," he grunted into the receiver. "Dean, it's Johnson from the station. I need you to know, there's an internal investigation coming your way. The higher-ups are furious about the video of the arrest. Internal Affairs is getting involved. You're going to need a lawyer." Barrett's stomach dropped. "What? Are you kidding me? I was doing my damn job." "Doesn't matter. The video has gone viral, and the department is under pressure. You'll have to defend your actions." Barrett slammed his fist onto the table. "This is bullshit. I've served this city for over 20 years, and now I'm the bad guy." The voice on the other end was calm, but firm. "Look, I'm just giving you a heads up. Prepare yourself, Dean. This isn't going to be easy." Barrett hung up the phone and stared out of the window. The anger that had simmered since the arrest now began to boil over. He was convinced he'd done nothing wrong, and yet here he was, being investigated by the very people he'd served alongside for decades. "Just doing my job," he muttered to himself, though the words felt hollow now. In her downtown apartment, Juliana Barrett stood by the window, looking out at the city below. She had just hung up the phone after a tense conversation with Amos' legal team. They had accepted her offer to help, and now she was officially part of the case. But with that came the overwhelming weight of guilt. She couldn't shake the image of her father, Dean Barrett, the man who had arrested Amos and now stood as the defendant in a case that could destroy his career. She hadn't spoken to her father in years, their relationship fractured by his narrow-minded worldview and authoritarian methods. Yet now, She was about to face him in a courtroom, on the opposite side of a battle for justice. "How did it come to this?" she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. She felt torn between the principles that had guided her life and the deep, complicated emotions tied to her father. The knock at the door startled her, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was her colleague, Sarah. "You ready for tomorrow?" Sarah asked, stepping inside. Juliana shook her head. "I don't know. I've been preparing my whole career for cases like this, but I never imagined I'd be going up against my own father." Sarah placed a hand on Juliana's shoulder. "You're doing the right thing. This isn't about him. It's about justice. It's about holding people accountable, no matter who they are." Juliana nodded, but deep down, she knew that this case was going to be the hardest thing she had ever faced. The night before the court hearing, Amos sat alone in his office, his fingers hovering over the keyboard of his laptop. He had been writing and rewriting his opening statement for hours, trying to find the right words that would convey not only his personal pain, but also the broader injustice he sought to expose. The glow from his desk lamp cast long shadows on the bookshelves filled with law texts and civil rights literature. Amos ran his hands over the pages of his notes, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. The door creaked open, and Lisa stepped inside, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Burning the midnight oil?" Amos offered a tired smile. "Just trying to get this right." Lisa handed him a cup and sat down across from him. "You've got this, Amos. You've been preparing for this your entire career." "It feels different," Amos admitted. "This time, it's not just theory or fighting on behalf of someone else. This time, it's me. I'm the one standing in that courtroom, and I'm not just fighting for myself, but for everyone who's ever been in my shoes." Lisa sipped her coffee and leaned forward. "That's exactly why you're the right person for this fight. You know the stakes better than anyone." Amos nodded, his resolve hardening. He looked back at his laptop and began typing again, determined to make every word count. The grand stone courthouse stood tall and imposing as Amos entered, flanked by Lisa and his legal team. Cameras flashed, and reporters crowded the entrance, shouting questions that Amos had no interest in answering. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. The seats were filled with members of the public, activists, and media, all eager to witness the opening of what had already become one of the city's most talked-about cases. At the front, Barrett sat with his defense team, his jaw clenched and eyes staring straight ahead. Amos took a deep breath and stepped forward, taking his seat at the plaintiff's table. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Darnell." Everyone stood, and the judge, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, took his seat at the bench. "Court is now in session. We are here to hear the case of Sterling versus Barrett. Will the plaintiff please make their opening statement?" Lisa stood, her voice calm and confident. "Your Honor, we are here today because Amos Sterling, a respected law professor and civil rights advocate, was wrongfully arrested by Officer Dean Barrett in an act of racial profiling. This arrest was not only illegal but deeply damaging, both personally and professionally. We intend to show that Officer Barrett's actions were not just a mistake, but part of a larger pattern of abuse that must be addressed." As Lisa laid out their case, Amos felt a surge of determination. This was the beginning of the fight he had vowed to take on. He glanced across the room at Barrett, who sat stiffly at the defense table, his eyes dark with defiance. This was only the beginning, and Amos knew, win or lose, the fight for justice had just begun. The sun filtered through the high windows of the courtroom as Amos Sterling took the stand. His presence commanded attention, but today, his normally composed expression was tinged with an undercurrent of anger and frustration. The courtroom fell silent as he began to speak, his voice steady but carrying the weight of a man who had experienced deep injustice. "I stand before you today, not just as a law professor or a civil rights advocate, but as a black man who was wrongfully humiliated, arrested, and treated as a criminal based solely on the color of my skin." Amos paused, his eyes locking with those of the jury, before continuing. "I've spent my life fighting for justice, yet that night, everything I've worked for was stripped away in an instant." As he recounted the events leading to his arrest, the courtroom remained still. Every word felt like a sharp indictment of the system that had failed him and so many others. Amos' testimony wasn't just about himself. It was a call to expose the systemic racism entrenched in law enforcement. His words resonated with the crowd, with murmurs of agreement rippling through the gallery. Across the room, Juliana watched intently, her heart heavy. She admired Amos for his strength, but knew that his fight was far from over. The trial had only just begun. Dean Barrett sat at the defense table, his face a mask of frustration. His lawyer, visibly stressed, attempted to shift the narrative, framing the arrest as a procedural decision in the heat of the moment. Officer Barrett was simply following protocol, the lawyer argued, reacting to a report of a suspicious individual near the hotel. But Amos' lawyer, Lisa Torres, wasn't about to let them off easily. Protocol? She repeated with a biting tone. Does protocol include ignoring credentials, dismissing explanations, and humiliating an innocent man? Or is that only protocol when the individual in question is black? As Lisa cross-examined Barrett, his earlier confidence began to falter. His rigid stance softened as the weight of the evidence, multiple video recordings of the arrest, eyewitness accounts, and Barrett's refusal to engage with Amos' identification, piled up against him. I was doing my job, Barrett stammered when pressed further. Your job is to serve and protect, Lisa shot back. Not to humiliate and degrade. When Juliana Barrett was called to the stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Here was the estranged daughter of the man on trial, known for her relentless work as a civil rights lawyer, now testifying against her own father. Juliana's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone. She glanced at her father, who couldn't meet her gaze, then turned to face the judge. This is incredibly difficult, she began, her voice faltering slightly before she steeled herself. I've spent my career fighting for victims of police brutality, never imagining that one day I'd be sitting here, speaking out against my own father. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. My father and I have been estranged for years, Juliana continued, her tone turning sharper. But that does not excuse what he did. What happened to Amos Sterling was not an isolated incident. It was the product of systemic racism that runs deep in our institutions. As much as it hurts me to say this, justice requires that my father be held accountable for his actions. Her testimony was raw and emotional, and the courtroom was visibly moved. The divide between father and daughter was painfully evident, and Juliana's words added a new layer of complexity to the case. She wasn't just prosecuting a police officer. She was standing against her own blood. Barrett's composure continued to crumble as Lisa Torres took center stage. Standing confidently in front of the courtroom, she laid out a series of damning questions designed to poke holes in his defense. Officer Barrett, she began, pacing slowly, you stated earlier that you were simply following protocol. But isn't it true that you ignored Mr. Sterling's identification when he offered it to you? Barrett shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I didn't ignore it. I didn't believe it was authentic. And why is that? Lisa asked pointedly. Is it because you assumed that a black man driving a luxury car couldn't possibly be a respected law professor? The question hung in the air, thick with accusation. Barrett's silence was telling. His lawyer quickly objected, but the damage had already been done. I was doing what I thought was right at the time, Barrett muttered, but his words carried little weight now. Lisa continued her cross-examination, slowly dismantling every aspect of Barrett's defense. By the time she was finished, the courtroom had witnessed a man's once steadfast confidence crumble, leaving only the remnants of his authority behind. After hours of testimony, cross-examinations, and heated arguments, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Everyone waited as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. However, as the judge reviewed the complexity of the case, the racial overtones, the systemic issues at play, and the personal conflicts involved, he decided to take more time to deliberate. Given the gravity of this case and the broader implications for our community, the judge said, his voice echoing through the courtroom, I will delay the final verdict. This is not a decision to be made lightly. A wave of unease swept through the room. The delay left everyone in suspense, unsure of what was to come next. Amos exchanged a glance with Lisa, his expression one of weary anticipation. Juliana, on the other hand, felt her stomach twist into knots, knowing that the emotional toll of the trial was far from over. As the courtroom slowly emptied, the looming uncertainty left the characters standing on the precipice, waiting for the storm to break. Barrett paced in front of the police chief's office, his nerves on edge. He had been summoned for a meeting that he knew wouldn't be pleasant. He knocked on the door and was greeted by the stern face of Chief Kessler. "Barrett, sit down," the chief ordered, motioning to a chair. Barrett complied, folding his large frame into the seat, hands clenched in frustration. "I've heard enough from internal affairs," Kessler said, his voice cold. "We're under fire from every direction. Public outcry, media pressure, even the mayor's office. It's a mess, and it's all because of your reckless arrest." Barrett frowned, disbelief flashing across his face. "Reckless? I was doing my job, Chief. That man was acting suspicious." "Save it," Kessler snapped, cutting him off. "You've put us all in a position we can't defend. You're on your own in this one. We've got to distance ourselves from you. There's an investigation underway, and you need to prepare for the consequences." Barrett sat in silence, the realization sinking in. He had spent years believing that the badge would shield him from scrutiny, that his authority would never be questioned. Now, the walls were closing in, and even his superiors had no intention of protecting him. "Is that it then?" Barrett asked, his voice low with resignation. "That's it. The department can't risk going down with you," Kessler replied. "It's about survival now." Barrett left the office without another word, the weight of betrayal pressing heavily on his shoulders. His world was crumbling, and there was no one left to blame but himself. Amos sat at his desk, staring at a series of documents that Lisa had brought in earlier that day. The room was quiet except for the rustle of papers and the occasional sigh of frustration from Lisa, who was reviewing more files at the other side of the room. "There's something here," Lisa muttered, tapping the edge of a document. Barrett didn't act alone. Amos raised an eyebrow and leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "This wasn't just some random arrest gone wrong," Lisa continued, her eyes scanning the pages in front of her. "There's evidence that Barrett was pressured by higher-ups in the department. They've been watching you for a while, Amos." A chill ran down Amos's spine. "You're saying I was targeted?" Lisa nodded gravely. "It looks that way. They knew your work was a threat to the status quo. Your advocacy for police reform, your calls for accountability. They set Barrett up to take you down, hoping it would discredit you." Amos's mind raced. The injustice he had experienced wasn't just a personal affront. It was part of a calculated effort to silence him. His anger flared again, but this time it was tempered with the weight of something larger. A deep, insidious corruption that extended far beyond one man. "This changes everything," Amos said quietly. "We're not just fighting one officer's misconduct. We're up against an entire system." Lisa nodded. "Exactly. And now we need to expose that." Amos felt the familiar fire of determination ignite within him. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Juliana sat in her apartment, the glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the floor. She had been going over case files when her phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number she didn't recognize. Hesitating, she answered. "Juliana, it's Travis," the voice on the other end said. It was one of her father's colleagues at the precinct. "Travis? What's going on?" There was a pause, then Travis spoke again, his voice strained. "I think you should know. Your father's been hiding something. He's sick, Juliana. Really sick. Terminal, from what I've heard." Juliana's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? Why hasn't he told me?" "I don't know," Travis admitted, "but it's been going on for a while. I think it's part of the reason he's been acting so erratic. He knows his time is limited, and it's making him reckless." Juliana's mind spun, emotions swirling in a chaotic mix of shock, anger, and sadness. Her father had always been distant, cold even, but she had never imagined he would hide something like this from her. "Thanks for telling me," she said quietly, ending the call. She sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the revelation settling heavily on her chest. Her father's illness complicated everything. Could she really continue to stand against him, knowing what he was going through? But could she forgive the harm he had caused, knowing how deeply it ran? Juliana buried her face in her hands, the dilemma gnawing at her. She had fought so hard for justice, but now justice felt tangled with pain and family. There were no easy answers. Back at his home, Barrett sat alone at the kitchen table, the remnants of a half-eaten dinner pushed to the side. His hands trembled as he poured himself a drink, the weight of everything crashing down on him. His body felt weaker these days, the illness he had tried so hard to ignore now making its presence known with a vengeance. The investigation, the trial, the humiliation. It was all too much. He had spent his life believing in his authority, in the righteousness of his actions, only to have it all stripped away in an instant. The sickness that ravaged his body felt like a cruel punishment, one he could no longer outrun. Barrett slammed the glass down on the table, his frustration boiling over. He was angry. Angry at the system that had abandoned him, angry at the illness that had robbed him of his strength, and angry at himself for the choices he had made. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his guilt. The faces of those he had wronged flashed in his mind, none more vivid than Amos's. The look in the man's eyes during the arrest haunted him, a look of deep, profound betrayal. Tears welled in Barrett's eyes, and for the first time in years, he allowed them to fall. He had always prided himself on being unbreakable, but now, he was nothing more than a broken man, facing the consequences of a life lived in blind arrogance. The cafe was dimly lit, tucked away on a quiet street far from the city's noise. Amos sat at a corner table, waiting. He had received a message from Juliana earlier that day, asking to meet. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. When Juliana entered, she looked exhausted, her eyes carrying the weight of the past few weeks. She approached the table, and they exchanged a tense nod before sitting down. "I need to talk to you about my father," Juliana began, her voice barely above a whisper. Amos listened, his expression unreadable as she explained what she had learned about Barrett's illness. He could see the turmoil in her eyes, the conflict tearing her apart. "I don't know what to do," Juliana admitted. "I've spent my life fighting for justice, but now, I don't know if I can go through with this, knowing he's—" She trailed off, her voice cracking with emotion. Amos was silent for a moment, his mind processing everything. He had come to this meeting prepared for confrontation, but now, he found himself grappling with a deeper question. What did justice mean in this case? Was it about punishing Barrett, or was there a greater principle at play? "I'm not sure what the right answer is," Amos said finally, his voice soft but steady. "But I know this, justice isn't about revenge. It's about making things right, for everyone involved. If your father is sick, that doesn't erase what he did. But maybe there's a way to hold him accountable without destroying what's left of him." Juliana looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and uncertainty. "I don't know if I can forgive him," she said quietly. Amos nodded. "Maybe forgiveness isn't the point, but redemption. That's something worth considering." They sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Both of them knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but perhaps, for the first time, they saw a way forward that wasn't just about punishment, but about healing. The courthouse was packed, the air thick with anticipation. The public had been following the case for weeks, and the final day of the trial had arrived. Amos Sterling, sitting at the plaintiff's table, felt the weight of the moment. His heart pounded steadily, but his mind was sharp and clear. This was more than just about him now. It was about justice for countless others who never had their day in court. Barrett sat across from him, hunched and weary. The once proud police officer had become a shadow of his former self. His eyes darted nervously, knowing that this might be the day he faced a judgment that could end his career, and possibly his freedom. The judge entered, and the courtroom hushed. Both legal teams rose as the judge took her seat. "We are reconvened today to hear final arguments before the jury renders its verdict," she said, her voice neutral but filled with authority. Amos' lawyer, Lisa Torres, stood and delivered her closing argument. "This case is about more than just a wrongful arrest. It's about an entire system of prejudice that has repeatedly victimized people like Amos Sterling. Officer Barrett's actions were not isolated, but part of a larger pattern. Justice must be served today, not only for Mr. Sterling but for every person who has been unjustly treated because of the color of their skin. When Barrett's lawyer followed, attempting to frame the arrest as a mistake made under pressure, Amos could see the fatigue and desperation on Barrett's face. The officer was crumbling under the weight of his own actions. As the judge prepared to dismiss the jury for deliberation, Amos stood unexpectedly. "Your Honor, may I make a statement?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The judge, surprised, nodded. "You may, Mr. Sterling." Amos took a deep breath and looked around the courtroom. Throughout this trial, we focused on the actions of one man. But this case is not just about Officer Barrett. It's about a system that allowed this kind of behavior to flourish for years. While I do believe that Officer Barrett should be held accountable, I also believe in the possibility of redemption. I request that instead of prison time, Officer Barrett be given the opportunity to participate in a community rehabilitation program, working directly with the communities he has harmed. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Even Lisa turned to him, wide-eyed. Barrett looked up, stunned. Amos continued, "This is not about revenge. It's about real justice. If Officer Barrett can understand the pain he's caused, perhaps he can begin to make amends, not only to me but to the people whose lives he's affected." For the first time since the trial began, Barrett stood. His voice was shaky, but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Mr. Sterling, I want to apologize for what I've done. I see now that I was wrong, deeply wrong, and I know that words alone aren't enough. I accept the consequences of my actions, whatever they may be, and I thank you for your grace. I will do whatever it takes to earn the chance to make this right." The courtroom was silent. No one had expected this moment of raw vulnerability from the man who had been so cold and dismissive before. The judge, too, seemed moved, though her expression remained professional. Given the request of the plaintiff, the court will consider the alternative sentence proposed. The jury is dismissed to deliberate. Outside the courthouse, Juliana waited. She had testified against her father, knowing it was the right thing to do, but the weight of that choice had been immense. Now, with the trial over, she wasn't sure what to expect. When she saw her father walking out, his face pale and drawn, she felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief, guilt, and uncertainty. "Juliana," Barrett called softly, his voice almost a whisper. He stood awkwardly, unsure if he could approach her. She walked toward him, her eyes hard, but softening as she saw the broken man before her. "Dad, I don't know where we go from here," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I want to try. I know you have a lot to answer for, and so do I. Maybe we can find a way to understand each other again." Barrett nodded, a tear rolling down his cheek. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make things right, Juliana. I promise." They stood there, neither saying much, but the silence between them was not as cold as it had been. There was, finally, the first step toward healing. Back in his office, Amos sat at his desk, looking out the window at the city below. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the skyline. His office was quiet, but his mind was anything but. He thought about the trial, the system he had fought against, and the personal toll it had taken on him. There were still so many battles left to fight. The justice system was far from perfect, and the police force needed to be reformed from the ground up. But today, something had changed, not just for him, but for everyone who had watched the trial unfold. Lisa walked in, a small smile on her face. "You surprised everyone today," she said, sitting down across from him. "That was powerful, Amos." Amos nodded. "I realized something during the trial. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about giving people the chance to change. We can't fix the system overnight, but maybe we can start with one person at a time." Lisa smiled, leaning back. "I think you did more than that today." As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, Amos felt a sense of peace wash over him. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. He had stood up for justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced. And in doing so, He had planted the seeds for a better, fairer future. And that was just the beginning.